what happens when the U.S. government decides, that decades of global economic integration just have to stop, and that protectionism is really the only reliable path to long-term national strength. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into the recent, really seismic shifts rocking North American trade. This isn't just some political squabble. We're analyzing sources that reveal the deep political, legal, and economic motives driving this, well, unprecedented era of economic nationalism. It's all been triggered by sweeping new tariffs, the resulting trade friction, especially with Canada, and the looming showdown over the future of the USMCA agreement.
Right. And our mission today is to really understand the core arguments, the unapologetic arguments for aggressively using tariffs to protect national interests. We'll look at how the very limits of executive power are being tested right now, literally in the Supreme Court. And critically, why domestic political concerns, things like protecting specific jobs, reducing drug flow, why those are now taking clear precedence over sort of traditional global trade policy in Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City. It's a complete reshaping, really, of how North America does business.
Okay, let's start with the hard numbers, the ones that really shock the global economy. Our sources show the speed and scale of these new U.S. tariffs are, well, they're nothing short of shocking. In just 4 months, think about that, between January and April 2025, the average applied U.S. tariff rate surged. It went from a historical low of just 2.5% to an estimated 27%.
Yeah, 7%, yeah.
That's the highest average tariff level we've seen in over a century.
It really is an economic sledgehammer. And what's fascinating here, I think, is the clarity of the administration's focus, their justification for it. These massive fees, they're explicitly designed to achieve 3 things. 1, promote U.S. domestic manufacturing. 2, protect national security. And 3, and this is the key part that's maybe not so obvious, substitute for income taxes.
Substitute for income taxes?
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more? How does a trade policy actually replace a core domestic tax like the income tax?
Well, you could argue it's a bit of a political masterstroke. See, tariffs generate enormous revenue, right? But they shift the perceived cost. It moves away from the domestic wage earner and onto imported goods. The administration argues this is politically easier, maybe strategically sounder, than just raising income taxes directly. So it functions as this new massive revenue stream flowing straight into the U.S. Treasury, but it bypasses the political headache, the friction of conventional tax hikes.
Right. And given the sheer scale of these duties, how did the administration legally manage to bypass Congress so quickly to get them implemented?
Yeah, that's the crucial question. They relied heavily on emergency authority. They claimed unprecedented tariff authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
IEPA. That's normally for things like freezing assets of hostile regimes, isn't it?
Exactly. That's its typical use. But now it's being wielded as this sweeping trade lever, and they divided the new duties into 2 main categories. And the difference in their justification is really key here.
Okay, what's the difference?
So first, you've got the trafficking tariffs. These specifically target goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. And they're justified explicitly by national security concerns over the flow of fentanyl into the U.S.
Okay, so a direct security link there.
Right. Then second, you have the broad reciprocal tariffs. These impose duties ranging from 10% up to 50% on products from, well, virtually every country globally. So the first uses IEPA for a kind of quasi-security enforcement mechanism, right? The second uses it as more general trade leverage. But both, importantly, rely on the executive branch's very expansive definition of what constitutes an emergency.
And the revenue numbers seem to back up the policy's intent for its supporters. By September 2025, U.S. tariff revenue was hitting over $30 billion a month. That's a tripling compared to the, less than $10 billion collected monthly back in 2024. So the money is definitely flowing back to the U.S. Treasury. But this massive unilateral action surely couldn't happen without an immediate legal challenge, could it?
Oh, absolutely not. That massive unilateral action is precisely why we immediately saw this shift, from the trade floor right into a constitutional crisis. This sweeping reliance on IEPA, on these emergency powers, it's landed squarely in the Supreme Court. The central argument is that IEPA was never intended to authorize tariffs or taxes or any revenue-raising mechanisms. Those powers, the argument goes, are explicitly reserved for Congress by the Constitution. The court isn't debating if the tariffs are a good idea per se. They're asking who actually gets to make this decision.
It's interesting, we focus on these huge trillion-dollar trade wars, but the actual constitutional fate of this entire policy hinges on lawsuits brought by relatively small companies, like small businesses, learning resources, hand to mind. They're the ones challenging the tariffs, arguing the executive branch is taking way too much discretion here.
Exactly. And that's where this legal concept, the non-delegation doctrine, comes into play. We should probably unpack that a little. Basically, they're arguing Congress cannot delegate its core constitutional powers like taxation to the executive branch. It can't just hand them over. So the lawsuit, Learning Resources v. Trump, it claims the administration is illegally doing something the Constitution explicitly says must be done by elected representatives in Congress. It really boils down to a pure checks and balances question.
The stakes just couldn't be higher then. And the timing is critical. The Supreme Court consolidated these cases, and they're scheduled to hear arguments on the legality of these IEPA tariffs in the first week of November 2025. Very soon. I mean, the stability of the entire U.S. economic posture for maybe the next decade could depend on this ruling.
Absolutely. And this legal uncertainty, it's also having ripple effects internationally. Our sources indicate that U.S. officials are let's say hypersensitive right now to anything that might influence public opinion during this judicial review. I mean, this is the administration's signature policy, right?
Yeah.
So the political calculation is pretty clear. If the courts were to actually strip the administration of these emergency tariff powers, well, we could see a powerful pivot. They could immediately turn around and use existing trade agreements or even threaten withdrawal from them as immediate retaliation or just to find new leverage.
Huh. So the legal fight happening in Washington actually gives them geopolitical leverage globally. The world is watching to see if the tariffs stand up in court, and this domestic battle is spilling over directly into our really critical regional relationships. #Tag3, the North American crisis, and the USMCA showdown.
Yeah, that friction caused by this America First posture, it's probably clearest right here in North America, especially with Canada.
We saw that incident where U.S. President Trump abruptly ended trade talks. Why? Because the Ontario government placed a $75 million ad buy, aired during the MLB playoffs in D.C., featuring Ronald Reagan denouncing tariffs. That's pretty provocative.
Oh, definitely provocative. And that incident, it's a perfect example of how domestic politics can really undermine regional integration. You know, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, his move, even though it was criticized federally up in Canada, it was politically popular for him at home. It solidified his image as a fighter against the administration. So it becomes this sort of proxy war played out through advertising. Meanwhile, you see Canada imposing its own measures against Stellantis and GM for shifting production to the U.S. When national manufacturers and jobs get prioritized so heavily, even your closest allies feel the squeeze and, well, they retaliate.
Which brings us to the next, probably much bigger test, the USMCA review. It's mandated, set for July 2026. And the U.S. president has already pledged to reassess USMCA, clearly intending to use those renegotiation provisions to address key national concerns.
Yeah, this USMCA review, this is where the national security and trade elements really merge, potentially quite powerfully. The U.S. is specifically citing things like the alleged transshipment of Chinese imports. Goods coming into the U.S. via Mexico, bypassing rules. They see that as a major weakness that has to be corrected. And we've seen some pretty aggressive proposals floated, you know, massive tariffs, maybe up to 500% on Mexican electric vehicles, or even a blanket 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, justified by the need to curb illegal migration and drug trafficking.
So leveraging trade policy explicitly for immigration control or drug interdiction, is that seen as a sustainable long-term strategy? Or is it more like pure short-term negotiation leverage?
Well, fundamentally, it is leveraging non-trade problems to try and force trade concessions. That's pretty clear. But the source material we looked at, it outlines a conservative rationale that tries to find a strategic path forward here. The goal isn't necessarily to just blow up the agreement. Remember, USMCA supported trade worth over $1.88 trillion in 2023, nearly 17 million jobs in 2022. Huge numbers. The goal is framed more as fortifying it, making it stronger from a national interest perspective.
Okay, so what are the guiding principles then for this USMCA review that prioritize that national strength angle?
Well, the core philosophy seems to be laid out in what they call Principle 2, prioritize external challenges. What that means is the focus should shift. It should be on directing North American resources towards jointly addressing these massive external pressures. Specifically, reinforcing North American resilience globally, particularly against powers like China. Rule 4, for instance, encourages using this review as a platform for deeper collaboration on countering unfair trade practices from, well, hostile foreign powers. So the conservative approach seems to be applying principle one, which is basically, if it ain't broke, don't try to break it, to the parts of USMCA that are working well for everyone, while simultaneously and aggressively fixing the structural weaknesses that are seen to compromise U.S. national security and economic independence. #tag IFEB. Final takeaways and provocation. So if we were to summarize the core tension we've really unpacked today, the U.S. has decisively shifted. It's using executive power, using mass tariffs to protect domestic jobs, reinforce national security, and it's doing this even if it means disrupting decades of integrated supply chains, even if it strains traditional alliances. The mandated USMCA review in 2026, that's going to force North America to make a choice. Either align policies to confront these external challenges primarily from China together, or risk the entire agreement dissolving.
Right. So why should you, listening right now, care about all this volatility? Well, the instability created by using these emergency powers that can be switched on almost instantly for core trade policy. It impacts every single cross-border supply chain, every market prediction you might try to make. It just demonstrates how quickly political will, especially when focused laser-like on the national interest, can potentially overturn decades of these globalist trade agreements we've gotten used to.
Exactly. And here's maybe the provocative closing thought to leave you with. The courts, right now, they're debating if the president has the authority under IEPA to tax imports without Congress. That's the legal question. But given that the USMCA itself allows any party, the US, Canada, or Mexico, to unilaterally withdraw from the entire agreement with just 6 months' notice, that's Article 36.6, well, the true constitutional question might not actually be whether the executive branch can impose these tariffs legally. Maybe the deeper question is whether it even needs to rely on the courts at all, if it ultimately holds the power to just threaten full trade withdrawal. That ultimate threat.
That 6-month withdrawal clause. Yeah, that's the sort of Damocles hanging over Ottawa and Mexico City, isn't it? We will absolutely be tracking this very closely, especially as the Supreme Court delivers its decision following the arguments coming up in November. Until then, stay informed. We'll be ready for the next deep dive.